The blood won't come off my hands. I just found Michael Davis's diary under his mattress. He's awake, and they're draining him alive. The security logs are gone, my access is locked, and James Miller just cornered me in the supply closet. I swung the defibrillator, hard. Now I'm running, but the handwriting in the diary changes halfway through. Someone else was here before Michael, and Dr. Sterling is coming for me next. The scent of bleach stung Sarah's nostrils, sharp and antiseptic. Yet it failed to mask the metallic tang of copper clinging to the linoleum. She knelt on the cold floor of ICU room 412, her knuckles white against the plastic handle of the scrub brush. Circular motions smeared the crimson puddle into a pale pink foam. Beneath the bed frame, tucked against the hydraulic lift, 3 unauthorized IV lines snaked toward the drainage port. Sarah pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from her pocket. They snapped against her wrists with a sharp pop. She bagged the tubing, the plastic crinkling in the oppressive silence of the ward. This wasn't just a mess. It was a map of a crime. She looked at the patient, Michael Davis, whose pale skin seemed almost translucent under the flickering fluorescent tubes. According to the chart, his blood levels were stable, but the floor told a different story. The floor spoke of a hemorrhage the machines hadn't logged. The heavy swing door creaked, a groan of metal on metal that made Sarah's heart hammer against her ribs. Kevin Miller slipped inside, his breath hitching as he leaned against the glass partition. His eyes darted toward the hallway before locking onto Sarah's hands. "Drop the brush, Sarah," Kevin whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked younger than 23 in the harsh light, his sorry Kevin persona fraying at the edges. Sarah stood, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with her shoulder, careful not to touch her skin with the contaminated gloves. "These lines weren't on the chart, Kevin. Someone bypassed the infusion pump. He's losing volume he shouldn't be losing." "It doesn't matter." Kevin stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the damp floor like a dark stain. He gestured vaguely toward the nurse's station, his hands trembling. "The server room is a furnace right now. Security logs for the entire wing are vanishing. Every timestamp, every badge swipe, gone. They're scrubbing the digital trail faster than you're cleaning this floor. If you stay here, you're just part of the evidence they're going to delete." Sarah gripped the evidence bag, the thin plastic bit into her palm, a sharp reminder of the physical world. Outside, the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator pulsed through the wall, a steady reminder of the heartbeat she was trying to protect. Kevin reached out, his hand hovering near her sleeve. "If you're caught with those, you're the only ghost left in the machine. Please, Sarah, just walk away." But Sarah couldn't walk away. She had a debt to pay. 4,112 apologies recorded in the small notebook in her pocket. And she wasn't about to add, "letting a man die in room 412 to the list." As Kevin retreated into the shadows of the hallway, Sarah turned back to the bed. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for what the scrubbers had missed. She felt the familiar urge to pull out her logbook, to record the minute error of the spilled blood. But her intuition pushed her elsewhere. She reached under the thin, stiff mattress of Michael's bed. Her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. She pulled it out. A battered spiral notebook, its blue cover stained with coffee and something darker. It wasn't a medical chart. It was a diary. She flipped it open, her eyes racing across the frantic handwriting. "They think I'm under," the first entry read. "They think the sedative took. But I can feel the needle. I can hear them talking about the harvest." Sarah's breath caught. Michael Davis wasn't in a vegetative state. He was a prisoner in his own body, watching his life being drained into plastic bags for a buyer who didn't have a name. The entries detailed the visits of Dr. Sterling, the rhythmic sound of the blood being pumped out, and the terrifying realization that his rare blood type, O negative with a specific, rare phenotype, was the only reason he was still breathing. He was a living well, being tapped dry. The air in the room grew heavy, the humidity of the Ohio summer pressing through the hospital's failing ventilation system. Sarah tucked the diary into the waistband of her scrubs, the cardboard backing cold against her skin. She had to move. The walls of St. Jude's felt like they were closing in, the sterile white corridors transforming into the ribs of a giant cage. She made for the supply closet, a narrow slit of a room filled with the scent of latex and rubbing alcohol. She needed a moment to breathe, to think. But as the door clicked shut behind her, she realized she wasn't alone. The smell of sour sweat and cheap peppermint hit her first. Then, the sound. Snip, snap, snip. James Miller, the head of security, stood between the shelves of saline bags. He was a wall of a man, his tie pulled so tight his neck bulged. He adjusted it for the third time, the fabric straining. "Hand it over, Sarah," James rumbled, his voice like stones grinding in a blender. He didn't specify what it was. He didn't have to. "I don't know what you're talking about, James," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her knees. She backed away, her heels hitting the metal base of a portable defibrillator unit. "The book. The one you took from under the mattress." James stepped forward, his massive frame blotting out the overhead light. "Doctor, Sterling doesn't like loose ends, and he especially doesn't like nurses who dig in the trash." He lunged. Sarah felt his fingers, rough and calloused, snag the fabric of her scrub top. He pinned her against the shelves, the boxes of needles chattering like teeth as the rack shook. The claustrophobia of the closet intensified. The walls seemed to sweat. Sarah reached back, her fingers finding the heavy, cold handle of the defibrillator. She didn't think. She swung. The heavy plastic casing caught James square in the temple. There was a sickening thud, the sound of a heavy weight hitting a carpeted floor. James groaned, his grip loosening as he slumped against the shelves, a row of gauze rolls cascading over his shoulders like a white shroud. Sarah didn't wait for him to wake up. She bolted. She ran through the ICU, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum. She reached the staff locker room, a place of dented metal and the lingering scent of old coffee. Her fingers fumbled with the combination of her locker, 143209. She shoved the diary into the back, behind her spare uniform and the small stack of apology logs. As she closed the door, she paused. She flipped the diary open one last time to a random page in the middle. The handwriting changed. The frantic, loopy script of the first half was replaced by a rigid, slanted print. "Forgot the socks today. They're coming for me." Sarah's heart skipped. This wasn't just Michael's diary. It had belonged to someone else before him. Elena, the nurse who had gone missing 3 weeks ago. The one who always wore mismatched socks. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't a new operation. It was a cycle. And she was the next spoke in the wheel. "Nurse Johnson?" The voice was smooth, like a silk cord being pulled taut. Sarah turned. Dr. Robert Sterling stood in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes already drifting to the ceiling tiles. He began to count, his chin bobbing almost imperceptibly. 1, 2, 3. "Doctor," Sarah said, her hand still resting on the handle of her locker. "You seem, Agitated, Sterling said, finally dropping his gaze to meet hers. The Sterling stare was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of warmth. The humidity in this building is quite unruly today. It affects the temperament. Perhaps you should take an early break. I'm fine, Sarah replied, her voice sounding thin in the echoing room. Just a busy shift. Is it? Sterling stepped into the room, the scent of expensive sandalwood trailing after him. Because I've just been informed of an incident in the supply closet. And now I find myself needing to conduct an immediate, unscheduled audit of all staff property. For safety reasons, of course. We wouldn't want any contraband compromising the integrity of St. Jude's. He gestured to the hallway, where two orderlies stood waiting. Sarah felt the trap snap shut. The diary was in the locker. The locker was about to be searched. She had seconds to act. Of course, Doctor, Sarah said, her mind racing. I'll get my things out of the way so you can start. She turned back to the locker, blocking his view with her body. She grabbed the diary, sliding it into the large pocket of her lab coat. She had to get it out of the room. She had to get it out of the wing. As Sterling began his meticulous count of the lockers, Sarah slipped past him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She made for the laundry chute at the end of the hall. It was a gamble, a desperate one. She opened the heavy metal flap. The air rushing up from the basement was cold and smelled of damp earth and lye. She dropped the diary, but the sound wasn't the distant thump of linen. It was a sharp, metallic clack. Sarah peered down the shaft. The diary hadn't fallen. It was snagged on a jagged bolt halfway down, dangling precariously over the dark void. A single loose page fluttered in the draft, threatening to tear free. She stood there, paralyzed, as the sound of Sterling's voice drifted down the hall, closer and closer. He was counting the tiles. He was coming for her. She turned and ran, not toward the exit, but toward the parking lot. She needed a moment of fresh air, a moment to think of a way to reach that chute from the basement. But as she burst through the heavy exit doors into the stagnant Ohio heat, she stopped dead. Her car, a modest silver sedan, sat under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. All four tires were shredded, the rubber hanging in ribbons. And keyed into the driver's side door in jagged, angry letters was a single word: silence. The wind moaned through the concrete pillars of the parking deck, a sound like a human voice crying out. Sarah felt a cold prickle of dread. They weren't just watching her. They were hunting her. She retreated back toward the stairwell, the heavy fire door clicking shut behind her. The air here was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke. She began to climb, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Going somewhere, Sarah? A man stepped out from the shadows of the third-floor landing. He was dressed in an orderly's uniform, but it was too small for him, the seams straining against his muscular frame. In his hand, he held a syringe, the long needle glinting under the dim emergency light. He lunged, his movements blurred and predatory. Sarah felt the cold sting of the needle graze her arm as she twisted away. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, the heavy red tank cold in her hands. She pulled the pin and squeezed. A cloud of white chemical powder erupted, filling the narrow stairwell. The attacker coughed, blinded and choking. Sarah didn't wait. She slammed the heavy tank into the door handle, jamming it shut, and bolted back into the main ICU wing. She needed help. She needed Kevin. He was the only one who had warned her. He was the only one who seemed to care. She found him in the nursing station alcove, his face pale and eyes wide. "Kevin, I need you." The diary, It's stuck in the laundry chute. I need to get to the basement, but they're blocking the stairs. Kevin looked at her, his usual "sorry Kevin" smile nowhere to be found. He reached out and took her arm, but his grip wasn't comforting. It was firm, like a handcuff. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I really am. But Uncle Robert said you were going to be a problem. He said you wouldn't be able to let it go." Sarah froze. "Uncle Robert?" "He's family, Sarah. And family takes care of its own." Kevin's voice lost its stutter, becoming cold and precise. "You shouldn't have looked under the mattress. You should have just kept scrubbing the floor." He pulled a radio from his belt. "I have her. Sector 4, send James." Sarah wrenched her arm free, the force of the movement sending a stack of charts scattering across the floor like falling leaves. She didn't look back. She ran. Subverted beat 1.9. Sarah's lungs burned as she reached the small glass-walled office of the night supervisor. The phone sat on the desk, a beige plastic lifeline. She grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number for the local police precinct. She knew the commander. She had seen him at the hospital's annual charity gala. He was a man of law, a man of order. He would listen. The phone rang once, twice. "Commander Miller," the voice boomed, gravelly and authoritative. "Commander, it's Sarah Johnson, head nurse at St. Jude's. You have to help me. There's a harvesting ring. Dr. Sterling, they're killing patients for their blood. I have evidence. I have a diary from one of the victims." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah felt a surge of hope. He was processing it. He was already calling for backup. She could see the blue and red lights in her mind, the sound of sirens breaking the oppressive silence of the hospital. "Sarah," the commander said, his voice dropping to a low, paternal tone. "You sound stressed. The heat wave has everyone on edge. Why don't you take a deep breath? I'm looking at the hospital's board of directors list right now. My name is right there at the top, next to Dr. Sterling's. We're very proud of the work being done at St. Jude's. It's a legacy of life." The hope in Sarah's chest didn't just fade. It curdled. "You're on the board?" she whispered. "I'm the chairman, Sarah. And as chairman, I'm concerned about your mental health. I think you should stay exactly where you are. I'll send some of my boys over to escort you to a quiet place where you can rest. We wouldn't want you hurting yourself or the hospital's reputation." Sarah stared at the wall. Beside the desk, a framed photo of the board of directors stared back at her. There he was, Commander Miller, smiling next to Robert Sterling, the law and the scalpel, shaking hands over a pile of corpses. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. Sarah hung up the phone. She didn't just feel betrayed. She felt foolish. She had tried to call the wolves to save her from the hounds. If she left the building now, she wouldn't be going to a police station. She would be going to a shallow grave in the Ohio dirt. She looked at the computer terminal on the desk. The internal network. It was the only thing they couldn't stop if she moved fast enough. She didn't need the police. She needed the world to see. She ducked into the nursing station alcove, the shadows swallowing her. She could hear James Miller's tie snapping in the distance. Snip, snap, snip. He was close. She had to get to the server room. It was the heart of the hospital, a forest of black towers and blinking blue lights. If she could get inside, she could bypass the local filters and send the scans of the diary pages to the cloud, to the news, to anyone who would listen. She moved through the darkened corridors, a ghost in white scrubs. She reached the heavy, reinforced door of the server room. The air here was vibrating with the hum of 1,000 cooling fans, a deafening whine that filled her ears. She swiped her badge. Access denied. She tried again. Access denied. They had already pulled her credentials. She was a ghost who could no longer open doors. She looked at the keypad. She remembered the code Kevin had used last week when he thought she wasn't looking. 0712. The date of Sterling's medical license. The lock clicked. Inside, the air was freezing, a sharp contrast to the sweltering hallways. Sarah sat at the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She pulled the diary from her pocket and began to feed the pages into the high-speed scanner. The images appeared on the screen, one by one. Michael's frantic pleas, Elena's warnings, the lists of names, dates, and blood volumes. Upload. 10%, 20%, 30%. A shadow fell across the keyboard. Sarah didn't turn around. She knew the scent of sandalwood. "It's a beautiful calibration, isn't it?" Dr. Sterling said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fans. He held a master key in his hand, the metal glinting. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father watching a child break a favorite toy. "The world is going to see this, Robert," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. "The governor, the board, you. It's all over." Sterling stepped closer, placing a thick folder on the desk next to the monitor. "Is it? I think you've misunderstood your role in this symphony, Sarah. Subverted beat 3.2. Sarah watched the upload bar. 45%, 50%. "I'm the one who stops you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I have the proof. I have the signatures." "Yes," Sterling said, opening the folder. "You do?" He slid a document across the desk. It was a blood transfer authorization form for a patient in room 412. At the bottom, in the space for the supervising nurse, was a signature. Sarah Johnson. Sarah's heart stopped. "I never signed that." "And here," Sterling continued, sliding another page. "A requisition for unauthorized sedatives, signed by you. And here, a log of payments made to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, under your name. It seems you've been quite busy, Sarah, using your position to harvest blood and sell it on the black market. I was shocked when I discovered it. Truly." Sarah stared at the papers. The signatures were perfect. Every loop of the S, every cross of the H. It was her handwriting. They hadn't just been deleting logs. They had been building a cage out of her own identity. "No one will believe this," she gasped. "The police commander already does," Sterling replied, his eyes drifting to the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. "And the news? They love a story about a hero nurse who turned out to be a monster. It sells more papers than a story about a hospital administrator doing his job. You aren't the whistleblower, Sarah. You're the fall girl. And you've just provided the final piece of evidence by breaking into the server room and trying to delete the records of your crimes." The upload bar hit 60% and then turned red. Connection terminated. The door burst open. James Miller stood there, his face bruised and his eyes burning with a primal fury. He didn't say a word. He raised a heavy security baton and brought it down on the server terminal. The screen shattered in a spray of glass and sparks. The hum of the fans died, replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. James grabbed Sarah's arms, his fingers sinking into her flesh like iron talons. He wrenched the diary from her pocket, the spiral binding tearing with a sound like a scream. "Take her back to 412, Sterling commanded, his voice as cold as the server room air. "We need to finish the paperwork. And Sarah, I'm sorry, truly. You were such a dedicated nurse. It's a shame you couldn't handle the pressure." James dragged her through the halls, her feet barely touching the floor. The hospital felt different now. No longer a place of healing, but a factory of death. She was being taken back to the scene of the crime, the place where it all began. But when they reached room 412, James stopped. The bed was empty. The sheets were stripped, the thin blue mattress bare. The ventilator was silent, its screen dark. The unauthorized IV lines were gone, the floor scrubbed so clean it reflected the flickering light of the hallway. "Where is he?" James barked, his grip tightening on Sarah's shoulder. Sterling arrived a moment later, his composure finally cracking. "Where is the patient? He wasn't scheduled for transport for another hour." "He's gone," Sarah whispered. A spark of something, not hope, but defiance, flickering in her chest. "Find him!" Sterling screamed, the sandalwood scent suddenly cloying and sickly. "He can't leave this building. If that blood gets into a public lab, we're all dead." James shoved Sarah into a chair, pinning her down. "You're not going anywhere." Sterling turned to Sarah, his face inches from hers. The Sterling stare was gone, replaced by the frantic eyes of the child who had been beaten for a B+. "It doesn't matter. We'll find him. And as for you, we have a suicide note to deliver." A tragic end for a nurse who couldn't live with her own corruption. He reached into his bag and pulled out a syringe. It was filled with a clear, viscous liquid, a lethal dose of potassium chloride. It would stop her heart in seconds, leaving no trace but a tiny prick in her arm. "Hold her," Sterling said. James leaned his full weight onto Sarah's chest, crushing the air from her lungs. Sarah looked at the bedside monitor. It was still plugged in, its screen dark, but the power light was amber. She reached out, her fingers fumbling for the saline bag hanging on the stand next to her. She didn't have much time. The needle was inches from her skin. She ripped the bag open with her teeth, the salty water flooding her mouth. She spat it directly into the back of the monitor, where the cooling vents lay open. There was a loud pop, a flash of blue light, and then the scream of the alarm. "Code blue. Room 412. Code blue." The hospital's automated system took over. The lights in the hallway turned a strobing red. The electromagnetic locks on the doors clicked open as part of the emergency protocol. But Sarah wasn't done. She lunged for the telemedicine camera mounted on the wall, the one used for remote consultations. She hit the emergency broadcast button, a feature designed for mass casualty events. "My name is Sarah Johnson," she screamed into the lens, her voice echoing through the hospital's intercom system and, more importantly, out to the news station's digital desk that was currently monitoring the hospital's emergency feed. "I am being framed by Dr. Robert Sterling. The evidence is in the laundry chute. Michael Davis is being moved to the ambulance bay. Help him." Sterling lunged for the camera, but Sarah was already moving. She dived under the bed, scrambling toward the maintenance crawlspace she had discovered during her years of night shifts. It was a narrow, dark tunnel filled with dust and the smell of old copper. She crawled on her belly, the grit scraping her skin. She could hear James's heavy boots pounding on the floor above her. She reached the end of the crawlspace, emerging into the cold air of the ambulance bay. The scene was chaos. Red and blue lights strobed against the wet asphalt. But they weren't hospital lights. They were state police. A black van was idling in the center of the bay. James Miller was there, trying to shove a gurney into the back. Michael Davis lay on the gurney, his eyes open, his lips moving in a silent, mournful hum. The funeral dirge. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, stumbling out of the shadows. The police officers, their weapons drawn, swarmed the van. They hadn't come because of her phone call to the commander. They had come because of the live stream. The image of a terrified nurse and a frantic doctor had gone viral in seconds, bypassing the local corruption and reaching the state capitol. James Miller dropped the gurney, his hands going up. He looked at his tie, reaching out to straighten it one last time. Snip, snap. But before the third snap, the handcuffs clicked shut. Sarah ran to the gurney. She took Michael's hand. It was cold, but his pulse was there, thready, weak, but stubborn. "You're safe," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took this long." She looked up to see Robert Sterling being led out of the hospital entrance. He wasn't counting the tiles anymore. He was looking at the ground, his silver hair disheveled, the sandalwood scent washed away by the smell of rain and exhaust. 6 months later, the gray Ohio sky seemed a little higher, the air a little lighter. St. Jude's was under federal receivership, the board of directors replaced by people who actually cared about the patients. Sarah sat in a small park outside the new rehabilitation center. She wasn't a nurse anymore. The legal battle to clear her name was still ongoing, and her license was suspended. But for the first time in 4,112 apologies, she didn't feel like she owed the world anything. A man in a wheelchair rolled toward her. His skin was no longer translucent. It had a healthy, sun-kissed glow. Michael Davis looked at the trees, the wind ruffling his hair. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a gift. It was a new journal. The cover was a bright, hopeful green. "For your new songs," she said, handing it to him. Michael took the book. He didn't speak. The damage to his vocal cords from the intubation was still healing. But he reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. It wasn't a weak squeeze. It was firm. It was the grip of a man who was finally, truly awake. Sarah looked at her own hand, resting in his. She didn't reach for her logbook. She didn't think about her debt. She just sat in the sun, listening to the sound of the wind. And for the first time in her life, she didn't apologize for breathing.